The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days when I received the encrypted call. November in the Cascade Range turns the forest into a cathedral of mist and silence, where even your breath seems like an intrusion. I was a field operative for the Department of Interior's Special Biological Assessment Unit, a division so obscure that most government employees don't know it exists. We investigate reports that fall through the cracks, unidentified species, ecological anomalies, things that don't fit into textbooks. The briefing was clinical. A logging crew had abandoned their equipment near the Nooksack River. The last radio transmission mentioned something watching from the tree line. When the recovery team arrived, they found massive bipedal tracks pressed deep into the mud, tracks that showed dermal ridges, a mid-tarsal break, and a stride length that suggested something over 8 feet tall. My orders were explicit: locate, document, and capture the specimen alive using non-lethal protocols. A containment team would arrive within 48 hours. I was given sedative darts, motion sensors, and a satellite phone that only called one number. I hiked in alone, carrying 60 pounds of gear and a certainty that would not survive the week. The Forest Service road ended at a rusted gate marked with faded warnings about endangered spotted owl habitat. Beyond that, only game trails and the memory of old growth. I moved slowly, noting everything: the Douglas firs rising like pillars into the fog, the smell of cedar rot and wet stone, the way sound died 10 feet from where you stood. My training emphasized pattern recognition. I documented the ordinary first: black-tailed deerscat, carpenter ant mounds, the scratch marks of black bears on madrone bark. Establishing baseline ecology isn't glamorous, but it's how you recognize when something doesn't belong. The abandoned logging site appeared on the second day. Industrial equipment sat in perfect working order, fuel tanks still half full. Coffee in thermoses had grown a film of mold. The crew had left in a hurry, but not in panic. Tools were stored properly, a radio left on its charging dock. Whatever they'd seen, it hadn't chased them. It had made them choose to leave. I found the first track 20 meters from the furthest tree they'd cut. The print was 17 inches long, embedded 4 inches into the soft earth beside a stream. I photographed it with scale markers, took soil samples, made a plaster cast. The impression showed clear toe definition, a human-like arch, but proportions that belonged to nothing in the anthropological record. The depth and spacing suggested a weight of 600 to 700 pounds, distributed across a bipedal gait. Standard protocols required I mark the location and call it in. Instead, I kept walking. The forest here showed signs of occupation. Saplings bent deliberately into X patterns, not broken by wind or animals, but woven with intention. Stones stacked in cairns near water sources. A hollowed cedar stump filled with crawfish shells, cleaned and organized. These weren't random. They showed purpose, territory marking, perhaps even aesthetic choice. I set up base camp on high ground with clear sightlines. That night I activated motion sensors in a perimeter and settled into the rhythm of observation. The darkness here wasn't empty. I could hear Roosevelt elk moving in the valley, the clicking of flying squirrels, the occasional splash of river otters. At 2:47 a.m., Sensor 6 tripped. Something large, moving deliberately between the pines, avoiding my direct line of sight. I watched through thermal imaging. The signature was humanoid but massive, showing heat distribution, unlike any bear or known primate. It stopped 3 times, seeming to test the air, then moved parallel to my camp, always staying just beyond clear visual range. It knew I was there. It was observing me observing it. Morning brought evidence left deliberately where I would find it. A branch placed across my primary trail, fresh enough that dew still clung to the leaves. 3 stones arranged in a line pointing northwest. Not threats, messages. The intelligence behind these actions was unmistakable. I followed the indicated direction and discovered a small clearing where something had been feeding. Salmonberry canes stripped of fruit, roots excavated with precision, and scattered bones from a deer carcass, processed in ways that showed tool use or remarkable manual dexterity. The bones had been cracked to extract marrow, then arranged in a neat pile. Nearby, evergreen boughs had been fashioned into a crude shelter, still fragrant with recent occupation. My satellite phone vibrated. The encrypted message was terse. Status report. Containment team deploying early. ETA 36 hours. I typed a response about continuing surveillance, then deleted it. The agency wanted a specimen. They wanted proof, containment, study. Every instinct from 15 years of fieldwork told me this would be catastrophic. not because of danger, but because of what would be lost. That afternoon I heard it vocalized for the first time. Not a roar or scream, but a sound between a howl and a mournful call, modulated with what seemed like linguistic structure. It carried through the forest canopy, bouncing off the mountains, and something answered from a distant ridge. A conversation, in a language that predated human presence in these mountains. I made a decision then that violated every protocol in my handbook. I left my tranquilizer rifle at camp. I carried only a camera, audio recorder, and water. If I was going to find this being, I would meet it as an observer, not a captor. The second night brought rain again, heavy and persistent. I sat under my tarp and reviewed my footage. Brief glimpses of massive shoulders moving through undergrowth, the suggestion of a sagittal crest, hands that looked both human and utterly foreign. In one frame, captured accidentally when I'd panned too quickly, there was an eye. It looked directly at the camera with an expression I recognized: wariness, intelligence, and something that might have been sadness. At dawn, I found fresh tracks leading to a rocky outcrop above a waterfall. The location offered a tactical advantage. High ground, multiple escape routes, a natural barrier. It was exactly where I would position myself if I were being hunted. My phone buzzed again. Helicopter insertion approved. Thermal imaging detected 2 signatures in your sector. Prepare for extraction operation. 2 signatures, not one. Somewhere in these mountains was another being, possibly dependent on the one I'd been tracking. A family unit. A pair. The isolation suddenly made terrible sense. They weren't just hiding. They were protecting. I typed my response carefully. Negative contact. Tracks are inconsistent with target parameters. Recommend repositioning search grid. It was the first lie I'd ever filed in an official report. It would not be the last. I found him at the waterfall at first light, and the moment has played in my mind 10,000 times since. He was kneeling at the water's edge, motionless in a way that only wild things achieve. The early sun broke through the mist and illuminated him in profile, 8.5 feet tall even in a crouch, covered in reddish-brown hair that shed water like otter fur. His hands, massive and calloused, moved through the shallows with surprising gentleness, collecting something I couldn't see. I stood frozen 50 meters away, my camera recording automatically. Every detail was impossible and perfect. The sagittal crest rising from his skull, the muscled slope of his shoulders, the way his spine curved in a posture that was both human and profoundly other. He was real, completely, undeniably real. Then he turned his head and looked directly at me. His eyes were amber, flecked with gold, set in a face that merged human features with something older, something that had followed a different evolutionary path. There was no fear in his expression, only assessment. He held my gaze for perhaps 5 seconds, enough time for me to understand that consciousness looked out from behind those eyes, that whatever this being was, he was a person in every way that mattered. He made a sound, low and resonant, that I felt in my chest. Not a threat. A greeting, perhaps, or a warning. Then he rose to his full height, towering, magnificent, terrible in his vulnerability, and I saw what he'd been gathering from the stream. Crayfish. He'd collected them in a woven basket made from cedar strips, worked with the same craftsmanship I'd seen in Native American museums. The basket was old, repaired multiple times, and he clutched it carefully as he stepped backward toward the forest. I raised my hand, palm forward, the universal gesture of peace. My voice cracked when I spoke. "I'm not here to hurt you." He paused, tilted his head with a curiosity that looked achingly familiar. Then from the forest behind him came another sound, higher pitched, smaller, a response call. Understanding crashed over me. He was foraging, bringing food back to someone who depended on him. The evidence I'd been interpreting as territorial marking was something else entirely. The signs of a family trying to survive in an ever-shrinking wilderness. He watched me watching him, and in that moment we shared something beyond language. He was asking me a question with his stillness. What kind of human was I? Would I be like the ones who cut down forests and filled valleys with roads? Or would I be something else? I lowered my camera slowly and took 3 steps backward, then 3 more. His shoulders relaxed infinitesimally. He gave a short, sharp vocalization, an acknowledgement, and melted into the undergrowth with impossible silence for something so large. I stood by the waterfall for 20 minutes, shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of what I now carried. Certain knowledge of a species that had survived by remaining hidden, and orders to betray that survival for the sake of scientific curiosity, and bureaucratic validation. My phone showed 6 missed calls from the agency. The containment team was en route, and I had perhaps 12 hours to decide whether I was a scientist, a soldier, or something else entirely. I hiked back to camp and sat with my data, photographs, audio recordings, plaster casts, GPS coordinates, evidence that would revolutionize primatology, rewrite anthropology textbooks, vindicate every amateur researcher who'd ever been dismissed as a crank, career-defining proof, irrefutable documentation. I thought about what would happen next. The containment protocols I'd been briefed on were clinical: chemical sedation, helicopter extraction, transportation to a secure facility. Minimal stress procedures, they called it, as if there was a humane way to rip a sentient being from the only home he'd ever known. I'd seen those facilities: sterile concrete rooms with observation glass, enrichment protocols designed by people who'd never spent a day in actual wilderness. I imagined him in a cage, no matter how large or naturalistic. I imagined researchers in clean rooms studying his vocalizations, his tool use, his social behaviors. I imagined the media circus, the political debates about classification and rights, the inevitable tourism that would turn these mountains into a spectacle. And I imagined the other one, the smaller voice in the forest, alone. My training emphasized objectivity: document, report, let others make policy decisions. Science requires evidence, and evidence requires specimens. The pursuit of knowledge justifies temporary discomfort. These were the arguments I'd internalized over 15 years. But knowledge isn't neutral. Discovery isn't innocent. The history of anthropology is littered with specimens who were people: indigenous individuals displayed in museums, sacred sites excavated for curiosity, communities disrupted for data. We've always told ourselves it was for the greater good, for understanding, for progress. I opened my laptop and began typing my official report. Detailed observations, behavioral notes, estimated population, 2 individuals, possibly more, habitat range, evidence of tool use and linguistic communication. Everything the agency wanted. Then I highlighted it all and pressed delete. I wrote instead, after extensive investigation, tracks determined to be hoax perpetrated by logging crew. Evidence of costume fabrication found at site. No biological anomaly present. Recommend closing investigation. My hands were steady as I typed it. The lie was specific enough to be plausible, vague enough to discourage follow-up. It would disappoint them, but disappointment fades. Captured creatures don't recover their freedom. The phone rang. My supervisor, Director Chen. I let it go to voicemail. She called again, immediately. On the 3rd attempt, I answered. Patterson, what the hell is your delay? The team is 20 minutes out and you haven't marked a capture zone. There's nothing to capture, Director. False alarm. Silence on the line, dangerous and evaluating. Your preliminary report indicated clear evidence, which is why I investigated thoroughly before wasting resources. It's a hoax, sophisticated, but human-made. We have satellite thermal imaging showing black bears, Roosevelt elk. I can send you comparative data on thermal signatures if you need it. Another pause. I could hear her breathing, calculating. Patterson, if you're compromising this operation, I'm saving the agency from embarrassment, ma'am. Unless you want congressional hearings about why we deployed containment teams based on Halloween costumes. It was a gamble. Bureaucrats fear humiliation more than they desire discovery. After 10 seconds that felt like an hour, Chen spoke again. You're certain? Completely. Submit your full report by 1800 hours. And Patterson? This goes in your permanent record. Understood. She hung up. I sat in the rain and waited for my hands to stop shaking. I spent the rest of the day dismantling my camp, but I didn't leave the area. Instead, I repositioned a mile north and established a minimal observation post. If the containment team swept the region, and they would, despite my report, I wanted to document what happened next. They arrived by helicopter at dusk, 6 people in tactical gear with nets, chemical immobilizers, and portable containment units. I watched through binoculars as they deployed thermal sensors and ground-penetrating radar, treating the forest like a crime scene. They found my marked locations, photographed the tracks, collected my plaster casts. What they didn't find was any trace of the beings who lived here. The forest had swallowed all evidence like water closing over a stone. By midnight, the team packed up and departed, frustrated but not suspicious. My false report had given the creatures a window and they'd used it. I felt a small, guilty satisfaction, but I couldn't leave yet. I needed to understand what I was protecting, not just what I was protecting them from. Over the next 3 days, I observed from a distance. I saw him return to the waterfall twice more, always cautious, always checking the forest before approaching. Once I heard both voices calling to each other across the valley, a duet that spoke of connection, of pair bonding, of something that transcended species boundaries. On the 4th morning, I found a gift at my observation post, a bundle of cedar boughs arranged in a spiral pattern, and beside it 3 perfect obsidian arrowheads, ancient, pre-Columbian, the kind you'd find in museum collections. They'd been cleaned recently, placed deliberately where I would see them. He knew I'd stayed, and this was his response. Not just acknowledgement, but sharing. These artifacts represented his connection to this land, his history in these mountains. He was telling me that his people had been here before mine, that this was their home in a way I could never claim. I sat with those arrowheads for a long time, understanding flooding through me. The agency saw an unclassified species, a biological curiosity. I saw what should have been obvious from the start. A remnant population surviving against impossible odds, maintaining their culture in the margins of a world that had no room for them. Every argument for capture, scientific value, public knowledge, conservation efforts, crumbled against this reality. These beings had survived millennia by remaining hidden. Discovery wouldn't save them. It would be the beginning of their end. I thought about the spotted owl, the gray wolf, the grizzly bear, species we'd protected by studying them, containing them, managing them into smaller and smaller territories, until protection became just another form of extinction. We saved them from being shot by turning them into research subjects and tourist attractions. We took away their autonomy and called it conservation. I couldn't do that here. Not to beings who showed clear self-awareness, cultural transmission, intentional communication. The ethical line wasn't between human and animal. It was between respecting autonomy and violating it for our own purposes. I left my own gift, a field guide to edible plants of the Pacific Northwest, a first aid kit with basic supplies, and a laminated map showing the locations of every planned logging operation in the region for the next 5 years. Information for information. Respect for respect. When I hiked out the next morning, I left the arrowheads where I'd found them. They weren't mine to take. Like everything else in that forest, they belonged to those who had earned the right to remain unseen. The agency debriefing took 6 hours. I sat in a windowless room in Seattle and repeated my story to 3 different review boards: hoax investigation, resource allocation, and mission effectiveness. They scrutinized my photos. I'd included only the least compelling ones, questioned my methodology, and expressed disappointment that I hadn't called for backup sooner. Director Chen was icily professional. This represents significant waste of departmental resources, Patterson. Helicopter deployment, containment team mobilization, equipment allocation, all based on your preliminary assessment, which is why I insisted on thorough verification before escalating further, I replied. Better embarrassment now than congressional oversight later. She didn't like it, but she accepted it. The agency had a reputation for chasing ghosts. One more false lead would be forgotten within a budget cycle. My personnel file noted judgment concerns and possible credibility issues, but no formal disciplinary action. I was reassigned to desk analysis, effectively sidelined. I accepted the demotion without protest. What I didn't expect was the logging company's response. 3 weeks after I filed my report, they announced an expansion of operations in the Nooksack watershed. The crew that had fled returned with reinforcements and better equipment. Apparently, my official conclusion that nothing unusual existed in the area had removed their final hesitation about working there. I'd saved 2 beings from capture by making their home look safe for industrial development. The bitter irony kept me awake at night. I started making calls to environmental groups, tribal councils, conservation nonprofits. I couldn't tell them the real reason we needed to protect that watershed, so I used every other argument: endangered species habitat, salmon spawning grounds, old-growth ecosystem value, sacred indigenous sites. None of it was false. It just wasn't the whole truth. The Lummi Nation was most receptive. Their elder council listened to my carefully worded concerns about ecologically sensitive areas and cultural resources that needed protection. They didn't ask what I wasn't saying, but I suspect they knew. Their stories spoke of forest people who'd lived alongside their ancestors, beings who deserved respect and distance. Within 2 months, they'd filed an injunction citing treaty rights and environmental impact requirements. The logging expansion was delayed, then redirected to a different watershed. The Nooksack region received preliminary designation as a cultural heritage site, pending full environmental review, a process that would take years. It wasn't permanent protection, but it was time. Time for the forest to remain quiet. Time for the ones who lived there to continue their survival. I submitted my resignation from the agency in April. Director Chen accepted it with visible relief. Pursuing private sector opportunities, she asked perfunctory. Wildlife consulting, I replied, which was technically true. I'd been hired by a coalition of indigenous tribes to conduct habitat assessments and develop conservation strategies. My government security clearance evaporated with my resignation, along with my access to classified files and my obligation to report unusual findings. I was finally free to see without the requirement to capture. My last day, I cleaned out my desk and found a note in my personal belongings that I hadn't put there. It contained coordinates, not for the Cascades, but for a remote area of Vancouver Island. Below the numbers, a single word in handwriting I didn't recognize: family. Someone in the agency knew what I'd done, and rather than expose me, they'd given me information that suggested the population was larger than 2 individuals, more widespread than one isolated valley. I burned the note immediately, but I memorized the coordinates. I returned to the Nooksack one final time in late autumn, ostensibly to collect personal research equipment I'd left behind. In reality, I needed to know if my deception had held, if the protection measures had worked. The forest looked unchanged, mist clinging to the firs, the sound of the river constant and soothing. But the signs were different now. The X-pattern saplings had been reinforced, expanded. New stone cairns marked territories I hadn't seen before, and near the waterfall I found a structure I hadn't noticed in my original survey. A carefully constructed windbreak woven from cedar bark, positioned to overlook the valley below. An observation post, like mine had been, but permanent. I understood then that I'd never been the only one watching. He'd been studying me as carefully as I'd studied him, assessing my intentions, my character, my worthiness to know what I knew. Every piece of evidence I'd found had been carefully curated, enough to prove existence, not enough to enable capture. He'd been controlling the entire encounter from the beginning. I heard movement behind me, deliberate, unmistakable. I turned slowly, hands visible and empty. He stood 30 feet away, even larger than I remembered, but relaxed in his posture. Beside him was a smaller figure, female I thought, though I had no scientific basis for the assumption. She was perhaps 7 feet tall, covered in darker fur, and she held something wrapped in leather. They'd come together this time, a statement of trust, or perhaps a test. I lowered myself to a sitting position, making myself smaller, less threatening. The female approached first while he remained watchful. She set the leather bundle on the ground between us, then retreated to his side. When I unwrapped it, I found 4 items: a stone scraper showing sophisticated napping technique, a woven basket different from the one I'd seen before, a carved piece of antler depicting what looked like a family group, and a dried salmon, smoked, preserved, offered. They were giving me their culture, not as specimens but as ambassadors. This was diplomacy. I reached into my pack slowly and withdrew what I'd brought: a detailed map showing every protected area in Washington and British Columbia, marked with territories that had strong legal preservation status. It was information that could help them survive, understand where humans had agreed to limit their expansion. I set it beside their gifts and backed away. The male approached, studied the map with clear comprehension, then looked at me. In his eyes I saw acknowledgement. We had reached an understanding. I would guard their secret. They would continue existing in the margins. We were both protecting the same thing, the possibility of coexistence without domination. He made a sound, complex and modulated, and she responded. Then they gathered the map and melted back into the forest, leaving their gifts behind. I understood the exchange. The artifacts were my responsibility now, proof that I kept for no one else, evidence that would never see a laboratory. I was to be their witness, not their exposer, their advocate, not their captor. I wrapped the items carefully and packed them away. Then I did something that felt ceremonial, though I had no name for the ritual. I erased every GPS coordinate from my devices, destroyed every detailed map, wiped every file that could lead someone else to this place. Some knowledge isn't meant to be shared. Some discoveries serve the world better by remaining hidden, and some beings deserve the dignity of existing outside human classification, human study, human control. I walked out of those mountains carrying 4 objects and 1 conviction. The greatest act of science is sometimes knowing what not to reveal. I keep the artifacts in a safety deposit box now, touched only when I need to remember why I made the choices I made. The stone scraper, the basket, the carved antler, the preserved salmon, they're my reminder that discovery and destruction are sometimes the same act. The agency never reopened the investigation. My false report was filed away, and the region was quietly reclassified as low priority for biological assessment. The tribal protections held through legal challenges, and the watershed remains largely intact. Logging operations moved to areas where environmental review was less complicated, where there were no indigenous claims to navigate. I work as an independent wildlife consultant now, helping communities develop conservation strategies that respect both ecological needs and human livelihoods. It's satisfying work, though it pays a fraction of what the federal government offered. I don't miss the bureaucracy. I don't miss the pressure to produce results that can be quantified, categorized, contained. Sometimes I receive unmarked envelopes, no return address, postmarked from various locations across the Pacific Northwest. Inside are always the same things: photographs of tracks, scat samples, blurry images of shapes in forests, evidence from other people who've seen what I've seen, who need someone to confirm they're not crazy without requiring them to expose what they've found. I send back careful responses, always handwritten, always vague. Your observations are consistent with known wildlife in the region. No further investigation recommended at this time. Some phenomena are better left undocumented. Most understand what I'm really saying. A few don't, and I have to be more direct. If you care about what you saw, you'll let it remain unseen. I've been back to the Cascades 3 times since that autumn. I never venture as far as the waterfall, never attempt contact, but I leave supplies cached in discreet locations, first aid materials, tools, non-perishable food. They're always gone when I return, replaced sometimes with small tokens, a feather arrangement, a polished stone, once a perfect spiral shell from the coast 40 miles away. We have a relationship now, mediated by distance and silence. I protect their secret. They trust that protection. It's not friendship. That would be anthropomorphizing something more complex. It's mutual recognition of autonomy, a treaty between species negotiated without words. Last month I received a call from a young researcher, breathless with excitement about credible evidence of unclassified hominids in the Olympic Peninsula. She wanted my expertise, my contacts at the agency, my help securing funding for an expedition. I listened to her enthusiasm and recognized my younger self. The certainty that knowledge justifies any intrusion, that scientific progress requires bringing everything into the light. Let me give you some advice, I told her. The most important question isn't whether something exists, it's whether discovering it would serve its best interest or yours. She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Are you saying I shouldn't investigate?" "I'm saying that some mysteries are asking to remain mysterious, and respecting that might be the more significant contribution to science." She thanked me politely and ended the call. I don't know if she understood, but I sleep better knowing I tried to pass on what I learned. That the price of knowledge is sometimes measured in freedom, that not everything rare needs to be studied, and that the deepest act of respect for the natural world is sometimes simply leaving it alone. The forest keeps its secrets, and I keep mine.